about to leave, already packing, come with me, I'm not really asking.
Functional bus app that people actually want to use, then maybe public transportation would be more of a thing. Maybe it might turn people over from driving their car and switching over to using public transportation. And I think that there's a bigger impact on social and economic issues with that. And I think with the idea of making the overall experience a more positive for people who already use it, I think that's also important. So making it a more positive experience for people already using it, I think is just as important as switching people over. So I think that after the shift in designing the right thing rather than designing the thing right, we narrowed in on kind of the final design details. And there's a couple things I wanted to talk about too, but I think we could kind of open up the discussion more by maybe thinking about like maybe the use of only local materials. I think that's kind of an interesting topic because I think there's a lot of things to think about with sticking with local materials when you're designing something. And I think they definitely play a significant role in the design process. But more specifically, I will say that I think materials play a significant role because we had some restriction based on the material, but I think that actually kind of helped us come up with new ideas when we got those updates, like I was saying earlier, about new materials, and we're able to take that and apply it to our design and kind of bounce it off of each other inside of the group and how we could use those materials in different ways. And I think there's another question there, like being an advocate for using materials the right way. That's another thing maybe you could talk about, but I'll move it over to, whoever else wants to talk.
I could go ahead and
Yeah, sure.
I just wanted to talk about basically how Brooke and I worked on like the survey team, or like the team that actually went out and talked to people, or like really experienced what it's like to be in the buses and like actually use the system. And I use it every single day, but she used to and then came back to it sort of in a different sort of way. So we wanted to actually we only had 2 weeks for this process to actually really happen. So there wasn't really a lot, there was a lot of information we could come up with, but by the time we got it to the other teams, they'd already be on something else. So I feel like that was our most difficult part within everything. But what we found was really interesting is when you're on the bus, you have both this connect and disconnect of being both there and not there. Like you're a part of the community, but you can also put your headphones in, chill out, take a moment before you get to your destination to really just have a moment for yourself, but you still feel like you're actually a part of something, which I think is a really unique experience that needed to be addressed when it came to not only the stop, but the way that the bus is actually being used. And so we ended up talking to people about the bus stop and then how it would be heated. And I mean, no one's gonna say no to a heated bus stop. So that's something we learned right away. But the more we talked, we learned how people actually utilize the bus and how important it is to their day, and how 10 minutes of being on the bus can be a really relaxing and wonderful time, as well as you can find people that you hang out with and you can have a conversation, or you can just sit there by yourself. And I think that that's sort of the root of something that we didn't ever really get to within the 2 weeks, is just how we actually utilize this place, and how you were talking about how we kind of had this shift of, it's not just about the functionality of it, but the community that you can create from having this stop. So we could actually have a place that people could come to, hang out. We even had this crazy idea of having one mystery bus going around that had events happening, so you had to find this specific bus that created a community ethic sort of response. So yeah, I think it was just sort of the amount of time that we had, but I still am quite proud of the insights that we got out of this. So yeah. Did anyone else want to talk?
Can I ask you about that balance of public-private space, and how you navigated that within the design? I mean, I love buses because of the public transportation, because of that and how that came forward in your design.
I think that was like the most difficult part, was because we only had 2 weeks by the time we'd come up with those insights. We didn't really have time to put it into the design. But I mean, if we'd furthered it, I think it would be really interesting to play around with the juxtaposition of being both in and out. Like with the party bus would be interesting, or like having, we talked about like even maybe putting like outlets into like the space that we could actually run, so people could like charge and like have a little moment where you could have like, you could be like, meet me at the bus stop before I leave for 20 minutes, and we could have like a little mini meeting at the stop, and how that could end up becoming a community space. So, but then you could still get on the bus and tune out if you wanted to as well. So there's sort of like the opportunity to be both, which I think is really the most interesting part of it.
I have one more question, So when you're talking about these limited resources, and this is the thing that when you're having these limited resources in my world and the theater world, and I'm sure this is like the same in many other worlds, but limitation is stimulation. So of course you can come up with more ideas the smaller amount of materials or supplies or resources that you have. If you allow that imagination to run wild. Again, like looking at that, the kind of relationship between the limited resources or using local resources and this great imagination world of, what if we had this party bus that came around, what if we had a button at the bus stop and you push it and a disco ball came down and we had a dance party, which is a great idea. So like just how we navigated that communication within the groups and the different teams, thinking about like, okay, well, we only have this much, so we can't go that far in exploration, or if you allowed yourself to go that far in exploration and then pull it back to what's actually, realistic in the time with the resources that you have, how that process works.
So the other thing that we kind of hit on that maybe not so much was our material ethic that we tried to establish in this project, and to kind of go along the lines of designing for the good. We tried to design and build our prototype out of strictly salvaged building material. So all of this stuff, so if you look at our model back there, everything is made out of trash. This is all stuff that was going to be thrown in the landfill. So that was what we started with, knowing that, we're trying to use stuff that is considered trash right now in the eyes of other people. And from there, it was kind of a complicated process because I was the construction team, these guys were the design team, and we worked pretty hand in hand, back and forth of, okay, I'm like, I got this for materials. This is what are you guys thinking we can make this into? And it was really a back and forth process of, this is what I have, and these guys coming up with, okay, this is what we can do. Being realistic about what we're designing, because a lot of times as designers we can get carried away with the things that we're making. We don't think about the actual build part of it, and I think that was really what came out of this, was that idea that we have to be realistic with our designs as much as we have to be making good designs. Is it okay? Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, one of the biggest things with taking like all of this into consideration when we were working with the construction team was that we, as the design team, we came up with the general shape of the bus stop relatively quickly due to time constraints, but then we allowed ourselves enough flexibility through that initial design that construction team could go and add or subtract from that as needed based off the materials they had. We even had several iterative sketch group activities where we would go and you can see them back there, but we would go and have just different playful ideas of what kind of things could be added in addition to the bus stop. Like the main structure is there, we already know how it functions, but what are some little additions that you can add to it with the materials that we have that can really use this space the best we can? Like, for example, we were considering different ways we could add bike racks that were public. The city of Ames has been considering adding in some public bike rental spaces, and we were wondering if we could go and implement some of those into it. So you could just have bikes parked there, and maybe there's like some form of meter system or a card system where you could go and put that there, and you could grab a bike from the station in addition, things like that. And this just allowed us to have as much optimization of the idea as we could, which was a lot of fun.
How do you guys go about testing? I don't know if you had enough time, but how do you go about testing these things? How do you test the geometry or the material or the activity?
Generally speaking, if it held together, then it was considered successful enough for the time. But we would do some basic stress tests, like construction. Yeah.
As far as actually testing like our model and our idea, because we had I think we had 2 or 3 weeks to do this project. Getting that model constructed took a lot of that time, and we didn't have as much time as testing it. But we did have some things we got tested. Like back there, we have our small model that tests the heating system that we proposed with our model. So we are kind of, I don't know, we were able to see how that works and we're able to confirm that it does work. As far as how the bus stops being made out of salvage material would work, I think if we were to continue to work on this project, past the 2 or 3 weeks, we would have maybe set up some sort of, set this up outside somehow maybe, and right. Stop would just bring in more traffic if it just had maybe, a few blankets hung down and something like that, just to. Or a disco ball thrown in there, something like that. So the testing part, we didn't get to do so much, but we did bring ideas about it and what we could have done going forward had we had more time to work on this project.
Salvage materiality is interesting because in San Francisco and in the Bay Area, there was a controversy in that there was this artist who started finding salvage material and building these micro homes, like really, really small. Like we're talking about about the size of a dumpster. Really a little bit bigger, and he was. And so he was. So he was building these homes and then giving them out, and it was awesome and it was great, and he got students to help out, and he was building them out of this warehouse in Oakland, and then the city shut him down, and the reason for this is amazing. They're unsafe because the materials haven't been tested for residential use. And it brought up this really absurd argument about him responding, right, but they're on the street. And the city said, sure, but they're not safe to sleep in, and so they can't use them. And he would respond with, right, so the alternative is you're on the street. And they're like, well, we can't talk about that. We're just talking about the material that you used hasn't been sanctioned to be used in the city, or to be used as a residential property. And he would respond again with, and you just had this cycle over and over and over again with him saying like, right, but your alternative, you're not talking about the alternative, which is sleeping on the street. And they're like, we're not allowed to talk about that. We're only allowed to mention the fact that these materials are not safe for residential use. What if there's a fire? And he's like, so what? And so it brings up the question of, salvage and reusability. What are how do you navigate against kind of the bureaucracy of rules versus and safety against sustainability? And what is sustainability? Is it more sustainable to use a material that's been left over, as you said, someone's garbage becomes your treasure, but then you have to deal with the city saying no mas?
So guys, help me out with this here. But I can start by saying a few things. So like my project that I'm doing beyond this one here, it has to deal with a lot of what you just mentioned, all these materials that are used, or salvaged building materials, used materials, but they're seen as unsafe or not desirable, unappealing somehow to the rest of the world because it's trash or something. So I'm actually trying to figure out ways to solve this problem in my own project, but I don't know, I have the same kind of maybe passion you do, that it's ridiculous, I think, that we take these kinds of materials and just throw them away. And, to figure out what you can do with those things, I think it takes, like what I was talking about before, the prototyping and everything, just getting your hands on this kind of stuff, seeing what's possible with it, showing people that this stuff isn't trash. And maybe that would be a way to try and prevent it from being seen the way it is now. Maybe it could be used, to shelter the homeless in a way. It's just stuff that's going into the landfill, and we're throwing it away, when if you just take a little bit more extra time and effort, it could be used as something completely different. So, personally, I disagree with this whole view that we have on, specifically building materials, that it's all trash, and the way we go about disposing of it, I think, is terrible.
What are you doing to change it?
Working on it right now. I don't really I guess currently creating prototypes, trying to come up with stuff made out of strictly trash, showing people that it's not trash, and coming up with ideas about how it can be disposed of in a more ideal manner, not so wasteful anyways. Maybe coming up with a systems design of some sort that could reintroduce it back into the society somehow, so it's not getting tossed.
If I can make one suggestion,
Go ahead.
stop calling it trash.
Yes.
There's a very
Yes,
negative
I need to
connotation
stop.
if you keep referring to it as like it's
Doesn't help
waste.
my case.
It's just think of it as it's within its lifespan, if extending its lifespan.
Yes.
But by calling it trash, you immediately give people a connotation, and even though clearly it's not your intention to do that, it sets people in a very negative frame of mind.
Yeah, see, even me talking about it, I'm still stuck in my own mindset of that it's trash, and it's not.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. I was just gonna say that when it came to like the materiality, we ended up contacting SciRide at some point, and we tried calling them, but then we ended up just getting to like an email sort of vibe, and those can take a while, seeing as we only had the 2 weeks. So we ended up emailing them asking about materiality, and also if they'd ever tried heated bus stops, and all different types of questions that each team had. But we ended up never getting a response about any of the materiality, and we also talked like later in a critique at the very end of our project of the 2 weeks or 3 weeks, was that maybe we could take these materials, and if it looked pretty, and if we had it where it looked like we had specific bus stops that were like themed to certain materials or something to showcase them, it would then showcase that these can be utilized and they have a longer lifespan and stuff. So I think maybe if we were able to continue this, maybe we could think about not just combining the materials that we had, but if we had ended up finding more materials, we could then like, here's like one all based off of wood, and it would also create a community ethic because people are going to want, I think honestly, I'd find it fun to go to certain bus stops that have different materials being used, and then you feel like you're like hitting little mini landmarks within the city, which I think would be cool. So maybe if we'd continued this, we could have played around with that more.
And if you refer to it as public art or a sculpture instead of a bus stop, even though it is a bus stop, that can have different regulations around what's allowed and allowable in that space.
For sure.
You don't have to.
I guess I'm
Did
just confused by the number of narratives in the project. Is it about extending the life of materials, or is it about using transportation? You're probably going to say it's about all those things, but I don't know what the problem statement is, and I don't know if it's successful in meeting the problem statement, because I don't know what the problem statement is.
When we began, the problem statement was getting people to get on the buses, because we felt like there were a lot of people still commuting, which wasn't really needed, and also because it'd be reducing emissions within Ames because of the way that carpooling it immediately drops that. So that was like our initial problem, but then we began, the more we looked into everything, the more insights we got. The problems either got more about getting the community together, more about material ethics and the different materials that we're using, and it kind of just branched out from there. So by the end of it, with only 2 weeks, I don't think we'd necessarily hit home on just that first project or that first problem, but I think it was more about, for us as a learning process, of trying to figure out how to sort of navigate all 3 or all 4 of how many insights that we ended up coming up with that created different problems as we went on. So maybe it started with one, but then kind of rooted out to many.
It was definitely an exercise of kind of our process as interdisciplinary designers, and we kind of played on all our individual strengths. Is we've got architects and industrial designers and graphic designers, and really how we meld together into a project as a team, and that's really fueled the projects we've moved forward with the rest of the semester. So I don't know if it was specifically about the project goal.
I think it was more about the process, using an ethic, material ethics design approach, finding what those are in a project and trying to apply it, and then seeing what comes of it. Is really what was the goal of the project. I mean, there is a meaning behind what we did, but it was more secondary. More so about the process.
Well, so then the tricky part becomes, how do you test out whether it's successful and how successful it is? One of the things we focus on a lot is always being true to whatever phase of the design that we're at when we're teaching the studio is, what is your first principle? What is the one thing that no matter what else happens, you have to be able to solve for? Because if that falls apart, the rest of the it doesn't matter. It could be a beautiful object, it could be a great idea, but if you don't have that one question being answered, it's almost impossible to then kind of satisfy the requirement. So knowing the question that you're actually asking. I think what Jack is stating is it started off as this one idea, and then it's okay if the project changes, but then you have to restate the question. You have to know to yourselves, what is it that we're actually solving for? Because there's a ton of different ways to solve any of the questions you're talking about. Whether it's materiality, whether it's about sustainability, is it sustainability of materials, is it sustainability of the environment, is it about creating community? And it's just, any one of those things is perfectly valid, but if you don't state, he's jumping at a bit, if you don't state to yourself and stay true, and I make a point for my students to say, like, write it down, just put it on your desk, and at any one point, if someone can break down that argument, you're in trouble. Because, client's not going to pay for it, or you're not going to be able to justify the reason.
I just think it's a little bit too compartmentalized. The way that Tyler described it is that it's like everyone's seeming to find like what they're interested in. And I think a critique is that what is more interesting to me is to see someone who maybe is more interested in the construction side solving the original issue rather than coming up with your own issue to solve on top of the project. Like the interdisciplinary idea is that what happens when you bring a graphic designer to renovate a barn. Like that's the point. Like they're going to bring a new perspective. It's not just like, oh, you're the graphic designer, so you do this thing that you're trained to do.
I was just going to key in because I think Jack just made a good point, but to you, because you're the one that brought in, like I think stated really well about this trying to move the difficulty and the challenge moving from this kind of transactional idea. So we're trying to like quickly state a problem, quickly state a solution rather than have that conversation. So again, trying to get them people that the problem, if any.
Yeah, and to be fair, that was our third version of that project. After a year and a half, or almost it's at least 2 years of redoing the thing over and over again. And now it's me and Samina coming up with that idea, not with a bunch of students who've never addressed any topic of this aspect. Because when we left it to them, their first versions are just, we love it because they're just through the moon. It's like all over the place. Once, I think I showed you guys address this.
Yeah.
So sometimes having an outside force kind of dictate, as much as we hate it. I'm a huge fan of Levis Woods, who used to say that architecture lies in the conflict, and if there isn't one, it's the architect's job to create it. And we can extend that to just design lies in the conflict. And to what Jack said, I think it's really important that when you know what it is you're trying to solve for, to bring in those other skill sets to solve that original question, as opposed to, or to test out where the limitations of that question are, almost doing by negating. We talk about stance a lot. What is your stance? What are you fighting for? So is there a way to kind of push how far you can take it before it falls apart? And then you know where that edge is, and you can take it a step back.
But where's the process of inquiry in that? I mean, just the allowance for the exploration. And I know that, I mean, it's a different world that we work in. But can the goal be to see how these departments collaborate? Can the goal be to find more questions? Does the goal have to be to create conflict or create solution? Or can it be to like explore and, I don't know, like just allow for that process of inquiry to be valuable for society? Can we spend a lot of time thinking about hydrogen, floating bubbles, just because of what it does for humanity to like allow ourselves to go that far? Does it have to be so confined? I mean, I don't know, and I don't know if that's the goal of this.
Yes, I would say.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you really hit it. I mean, we talked to them a lot about suspending, right? That it's not about the final product, but it is about the sophistication. Like and so they actually came up with a lot. You'll see the posters around of all these different solutions, and questions, and methods of inquiry. Right? They were holding up, and then they came and tried to focus on one.
It's not to say, when I say conflict, I'm not talking about, all right, I have to solve one thing and call it a day. What I'm talking about is if, you know, the example I use all the time is, okay, everyone in the room draw me a picture of a house. And you tell everyone to do that, and more often than not, you'll get the same solution from everyone. They'll get the little square with a triangle on top and a couple of windows, and call it a day. Whereas if you say, okay, draw me a house where the pen can't leave the page, then they start figuring something out. And then you say, okay, draw me a house where the pen can't leave the page and you're not allowed to cross any lines. And so it's not necessary, it's not to say that inquiry is important. I'm a huge proponent of it. It's that I think there's an implicit element in inquiry that's oftentimes not stated explicitly, which is that, as Ashley, as you said, you're still trying to figure stuff out. Like, you're exploring, but what does it mean to explore? How do you decide whether the exploration is good, bad? Could it be better? Is it appropriate? Is it inappropriate? And it's not, is it appropriate to be built? Unless the question is, we are trying to build something in 2 weeks, how do we do it? In our studio, when we do the hypothetical one, we're like, don't worry about materiality. You're not at that point yet. Do whatever it is, as long as you can justify it for your client. That is where the inquiry resides. Whereas in the last project, the one we just did this past semester, it was hypothetical, but the inquiry has to accommodate for shelter and it has to accommodate for storage. And any way that they want to resolve that, we're fine. We're all for science fiction and to go bananas with it. But it has to be able to actually solve a question, because at a certain point it just becomes almost masturbatory. You're just kind of making stuff, and that's great. And that's one of the reasons I do my daily doodles, is to just learn that design tends to exist in a very high stakes world. Like, we think that our next design is going to be the best one and it's perfect, and if it's not, I'm a fake designer and I'm awful and I don't know what I'm doing. I'm going to be revealed to be a sham and I'm going to be fired, and it goes on and on. And it's like, at a certain point, it's like, just test it out. Just ask a question, answer it. It's almost like answering math questions without knowing what the question is.
I just want to add one thing to that too. I mean, you're saying like, draw me a house with these different limitations put onto them. But if you switch that and say, draw me a home, rather than draw me a house, the process of drawing becomes something completely different. And I think what you guys were getting at in your exploration was like this idea of the cozy, the idea of it doesn't have to be warm in the traditional sense of warmth, but warmth in terms of welcoming. That process of like placing the human in the design, where when you say draw me a home rather than draw me a house, it becomes the internal rather than the external.
It's almost like just thinking of it in a completely different way. So like just switching it to a different mindset.
I would say a feminist lens.
I think part of the problem is that it's just a little bit too predetermined, especially in architecture, that there's a built solution, or that in industrial design that there's a product solution. And I think that the scientific process isn't being followed if you, in the end, are told that you have to have a built thing at the end of the day. Because I think to increase ridership in this community, the 95 of the things that you could do wouldn't be anything physical at all. I know that y'all are all set up, and that you're not allowed to throw away the piece of paper they give you at the beginning. But I don't know, maybe you are. Maybe we should have less buildings and less things. That I think it's just so unfortunate, especially in architecture, and going to school for architecture, just kind of being beat into our minds over and over that, well, the solution is in a building, the solution is in the space, and it's about the materiality or something about that. But in a lot of the work that I've done, it has nothing to do with the physicality of what is done. That's so secondary, or even often more times than not even part of the solution at all.
Okay. That's good timing, actually. Ashley's up next, so thank you.
About to leave, already packing. Come with me, I'm not really asking. We'll get away to a place where we don't know.